Biram bom.
Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Wednesday, Yom Revi'i. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Wednesday night? Fourth night of Hanukkah. Freilich in Hanukkah. Hanukkah Sameach. Melissa in Great Neck, Yehud in South Carolina, Belle in Texas, Lucy in Minnesota, Gail in Kansas City, Bella in Florida, Moishi in Brooklyn, Chaim in Florida, Aoife in Florida, Nancy in North Carolina, Lester in Florida, and Marie in Freeport. Welcome, everybody. Quite a short daf tonight. I would normally make it a double. We're already, I think, 3 ahead, and we have to rush off because we had a good lesson. I just had so much incoming traffic, and I missed an invitation to Sheva Brachas, but the people were so sweet they followed up to make sure I received the invitation. That's when I saw it for the first time. So we have to rush off and go to a Sheva Brachas. These are the 7 nights of parties after a wedding here in the neighborhood. Okay, so our daf tonight is page 97 here in Tractate Zevachim, the 29th volume of the Talmud. We're going to pick this up on 96b, about halfway down, and continuing our discussion of Mishna number 5 here in chapter 11, talking about that obligation when the blood of an offering gets on the garment of a priest, or the flesh of a sin offering, which the priests are going to eat. If it's been cooked in a metal pot, there's an obligation to wash that pot. If it was cooked in an earthenware pot, that pot needs to be broken. And again, this isn't to render the garment or the pot, a metal pot, clean for the next use. That's different. Of course, we wash for hygienic purposes, but this is because something that is consecrated has been put in a place where it needs to be removed from that, because it's like we're taking care of the sacred, and we don't want it to go to a place where it doesn't belong, right? In other words, things that are sacred need to remain separate from the mundane. Okay, the Mishnah teaches whether the meat is from offerings of the most sacred order or whether it is from offerings of lesser sanctity. So most sacred order, sin offerings, guilt offerings, lesser sanctity, peace offerings, thanks offerings, the Pesach, the Passover lamb or goat. So whether it was from the meat is from most offerings of the most sacred order or from lesser sanctity, the vessels in which such meat is cooked must be scoured and rinsed. And the Gemara cites a related baraisa. Baraisas are teachings of very authoritative, but not as authoritative as Mishnayos. A teaching that made it into the Mishnah is a Mishnah, right? Mishnah, general term, and specific Mishnayos, that's plural of a particular Mishnah, for example, that got into the collection known as the Mishnah. A little bit confusing. And Baraisas are contemporaneous with Mishnayos, but didn't quite make it into the redacted edition of the Mishnah, which was done, as we'll be discussing tonight, by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi around the year 200 of the Common Era. So, the Gemara cites a related baraisa. The sages taught the Torah introduces the commandment of scouring and rinsing with the qualifying statement, "This is the law of the sin offering." Why does it only mention sin offering? From this verse, I've derived only that the law with regard to scouring and rinsing applies to vessels in which a sin offering was cooked. From where do I derive that this law applies to vessels used for all sacrificial meat? The verse states, "Every male among the priests may eat of it. It is most sacred," in Leviticus 6:22. So that's 4 verses later. And this is to teach you that this law applies to vessels used for all of the sacrificial meat that the priests eat. The Baraisa continues, one might have thought that I should include vessels used for cooking teruma. Teruma, consecrated food that only priests can eat, but it's consecrated as part of the tithing process, has nothing to do with offerings, does not need to be eaten in the holy temple, only needs to be eaten by priests and their household. Both the teruma, the food that was consecrated, and the person of the priest or his household eating it needs to be tahor, in a state of ritual purity. Okay? But this has nothing to do with offerings. So why are we talking about teruma right now? One might have thought that I should include vessels used for cooking teruma, the portion of the produce designated for the priest, as well, as it is also sacred and may be eaten only by a priest. But to counter this idea, the verse states, every male among the priests may eat of it. It is most sacred. That's talking about the offerings. So the emphatic qualifier of it excludes teruma. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon says, offerings of the most sacred order require scouring and rinsing, but offerings of lesser sanctity, like teruma, do not require scouring and rinsing, as it is written, most sacred. Accordingly, with regard to offerings of the most sacred order, yes, scouring and rinsing is required, but for offerings of lesser sanctity, no, it is not required. This is not the halacha. The Gemara asks, the Baraisa explains Rabbi Shimon's reasoning. What is the reasoning of Rabbi Yehuda? And the Gemara answers, since the qualifying term of it was necessary to exclude teruma, by inference, it must be that vessels used for offerings of lesser sanctity do require scouring and rinsing. If even offerings of lesser sanctity are excluded from the law of scouring and rinsing, it would be self-evident that the vessel used for teruma is exempt from scouring and rinsing. Accordingly, the direct exclusion of teruma indicates that the vessels used for offerings of lesser sanctity are not excluded. And Rabbi Shimon could have said to you, well, the term of it teaches a different law and excludes a disqualified sin offering from the law of scouring and rinsing, as we said earlier on page 93. And the Gemara asks, well, and is it correct that with regard to a copper vessel used to cook teruma, it does not require rinsing and scouring? But isn't it taught in a baraisa? With regard to a pot in which one cooked meat, one may not cook milk in it. And if one cooked milk in it, the meat absorbed in the pot renders the milk forbidden if it imparts flavor to it. And similarly, if one cooked teruma in a pot, one may not cook non-sacred food in it. And if one did cook non-sacred food in it, the absorbed teruma would render the mixture sacred if it imparts flavor to it. Sacred meaning only priests can eat it, no longer can other people eat it. Therefore, a pot requires purging with boiling liquid in order to expel the flavor of teruma from it. Now, 3 Amoraim address the apparent inconsistency that while the Torah excludes vessels used for teruma from the law of scouring and rinsing, the Baraisa teaches that these vessels must be purged. So Abaye said, when the verse excludes teruma from the law of scouring and rinsing, this is necessary only for that which the master said. If one cooked in only part of the vessel, the entire vessel requires scouring and rinsing, when we're talking about meat of sacrificial offerings. By contrast, in this case, if teruma was cooked in only part of the vessel, one must perform scouring and rinsing only in the place of the cooking and not in the whole vessel, right? And we want to remember that how did we get to scouring and rinsing for teruma versus how did we get to scouring and rinsing for a pot in which the meat of a sin offering was cooked? The Torah explicitly says that pots used for cooking the meat of sin offerings, and then we extend to other offerings, must be scoured and rinsed. Again, this is not hygienic cleaning. This is to remove traces of the meat of the sin offering from pots that might end up being used for something else, because the Torah said so. With regard to procedures that the rabbis enact to protect us from coming to mix dairy and meat, right? The Torah says 3 times, you shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. That's where we get this prohibition on meat and milk being eaten together, cooked together, or benefited from such a mixture. And those all 3 are prohibited. Now, because those are prohibited, If you cooked meat in a pot, then you're not going to be able to use that pot for milk because these things could end up mixing, right? And so if you're going to purge that pot of meat after you cook meat in it, it's going to require like purging, not just scouring and rinsing, but like actual boiling, heating, burning, etc. And then there's other laws that are related to that that are really outside the purview of tonight's class. The point is, even though it produces a similar result, right, it's for different reasons that we get there, and that's why the nuances are also going to be different. Rava said, when the verse excludes teruma, right, this is the third case. So sacrificial offerings, right, you must scour and rinse. Teruma, right, teruma, you won't even notice that if teruma was cooked in a pot and then later something else is cooked in a pot that's not teruma, right, there won't be necessarily a flavor difference. It could be the same kind of food. It's just that part of it was teruma, consecrated and set aside for a priest, and the rest was not, right? Could both be meat, could both be, some kind of porridge, some kind of wheat porridge. But you can't mix those things. You have to keep track of it. Now, in this case, it's not because of the flavor of meat and milk or just the mixing of meat and milk. Now, it's because of consecration, right? Teruma is consecrated food that only priests can eat. But again, we're getting there via a different mechanism than the explicit command that you must scour and rinse a pot in which sacrificial offerings were cooked. So Rava said, when the verse excludes teruma from the law of scouring and rinsing, that is necessary only for that which the master said. The verse specifies it shall be scoured and rinsed in water. But the vessel is not to be scoured and rinsed in wine. It must be scoured and rinsed in water, but not in diluted wine. By contrast, in this case, i.e. the vessel in which teruma was cooked, it may be scoured and rinsed even in wine and even in diluted wine, right? Because what we're doing is making sure there's no teruma in there, not because teruma would render any mixture in which it exists consecrated, right? That only priests can eat it, and you would lose the ability for a non-priest to eat it. But not because the Torah said you must scour and rinse a pot in which teruma was cooked, like it does for a pot in which the meat of sin offerings was cooked. Rabbi Bar Ula said, when the verse excludes teruma from the law of scouring and rinsing, this is necessary only for that which the master said. One must perform scouring and rinsing with cold water, in addition to purging a vessel of its absorbed flavors with boiling water. And by contrast, in this case, i.e. with regard to a vessel in which teruma was cooked, one may cleanse the vessel even by performing only the purging with boiling water, which removes the residue of the forbidden food and omitting the cold water processes entirely. So the Gemara asks, this works out well according to the one who says that scouring and rinsing are performed with cold water, which teaches you all you need to know, that it's about fulfilling a commandment and not, hygienic cleansing. But according to the one who says that scouring is done by purging with hot water and rinsing is a different procedure performed with cold water, then what can be said? According to this opinion, the verse is also referring to purging, and if the verse excludes vessels used for teruma, how does the Baraisa teach that such vessels must be purged? And the Gemara answers according to the opinion that differentiates scouring, which is done with boiling water, from rinsing, which is done with cold water. The Torah excludes vessels used for teruma only from the additional rinsing that the Torah requires after the scouring. Right, so this would seem to indicate that, about, cleaning a pot that had teruma in it before you could cook non-teruma in it, we're going to learn, right, some procedures and principles from the law of scouring and rinsing after a sin offering, but we're still distinguishing because it's not the same reason or the same source or commandment. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 5 here in chapter 11. We move on to Mishnah 6. Rabbi Tarfon says, if one cooked a sin offering in a copper vessel from the beginning of the pilgrimage festival, one may cook in it for the entire pilgrimage festival. What are the pilgrimage festivals? Shavuos, Pesach, and Sukkot. Not in that order. Right? Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. Right? When the temple was standing, would walk up to Jerusalem and bring their offerings. That's why it's called a pilgrimage festival. Right, so the point is, if you're cooking sin offerings, now who's cooking sin offerings? Only the priests in the holy temple. Other people might be cooking peace offerings, but sin offerings are only, and these are the ones that are mentioned explicitly in the Torah, although this will apply to the meat of peace offerings as well. But let's keep reading. Rabbi Tarfon says, if one cooked a sin offering in a copper vessel from the beginning of the pilgrimage festival, one may cook in it for the entire pilgrimage festival. He need not scour and rinse the vessel after every use, right? And what's the difference? Scouring and rinsing has to be done in the holy temple. Actual just regular cleaning the pot so you could use it again, that doesn't have to be done in the courtyard of the holy temple. And the rabbis say one may not continue using it in this manner. Rather, one must perform scouring and rinsing before the end of the period during which partaking of the particular cooked offering is permitted, right? So each day you offer a sin offering, so you have that day and that night to eat the meat of it, and when you're eating the meat of it, that's when you need to do the scouring and rinsing. Even if it's several in a row, you're going to have to do scouring and rinsing after each of them. Several days in a row, but you have to do the scouring and rinsing every day. Scouring is like the scouring of the inside of a cup, the cleaning done when wine sticks to the cup, and rinsing is like the rinsing of the outside of a cup. Scouring and rinsing are both performed with cold water, according to the Mishna, but this seems to be the view of the rabbis, okay, so the majority. And it says, with regard to the spit and the metal grill, one purges them in hot water. That's 90. Now we're on 97a, and that's the end of Mishnah 6. Now the Gemara. The Mishnah teaches that Rabbi Tarfon says, if one cooked a sin offering in a vessel from the beginning of the festival, one may cook in it for the entire festival without scouring and rinsing the vessel after every use, and without being concerned that he has eaten forbidden leftover meat. Right? You see, because you only have the day and that night to eat meat of a sin offering. So then if you only do a regular cleaning, not this special scouring and rinsing, maybe there's some leftover residue of that meat in the pot, and now you're going to be eating it beyond that deadline, right? That would be notar. But you don't have to be concerned about that because it's just a trace, right? The Gemara asks, what is the reason, according to Rabbi Tarfon, what is the reasoning of Rabbi Tarfon? The Gemara answers, it is as the verse states with regard to the Pesach, the Passover lamb or goat, quote, and you shall roast and eat it in the place that the Lord your God shall choose, and you shall turn in the morning and go to your tents. Deuteronomy 16:7. Although one does not leave Jerusalem on the first morning of Passover, which is a holiday, the verse has rendered all of those days over which one remains there equal to one morning, right? So they're saying that, well, you go up to Jerusalem for the pilgrimage festival, you don't just, party that first night and leave the next day. First of all, the next day is still the festival itself, right? If we're talking about Passover or Sukkot, the first day is full-on festival, and so you certainly wouldn't leave that very next day, the next morning. And probably you're not supposed to leave during the intermediate days either. You made the pilgrimage, stay there for the week-long festival, and then leave. And you shall not turn them. Right. So Rav Achadvoy Bar Ami objects to this. Can it be that all the days of the festival are considered a single day? But is there no prohibition against bringing an offering that was sacrificed with the intent to consume it after its appointed time? Piggul, we discussed many times. Does piggul not exist during a festival? If it's all one day, does that mean that I can then eat it for 6 days? And it's not going to trigger piggul? And is there no prohibition of notar? Right? Even if you didn't have that intent at the outset, if you just ate it after 6 days, would that be okay because all the festival days are like one day? No, that's not so. So how can you say all the festival days are like one day? Both these prohibitions are based on the premise that each offering may be eaten over a limited time, far less than the duration of an entire week-long festival. And if you would say, indeed, neither piggul nor notar apply during a festival, well, that's difficult. But it is taught in a baraisa that Rabbi Tarfon said that an entire festival is considered a single day only with regard to this, the laws of scouring and rinsing. Okay, maybe you don't have to scour and rinse if you keep reusing the pot every day during a festival. But with regard to notar and piggul, no, we don't consider all the festival like one day. And the Gemara continues, so rather one must explain that Rabbi Tarfon's opinion accords with that which Rav Nachman says, citing Rabbi Bar Avu. As Rav Nachman says that Rabbi Bar Avu says, scouring and rinsing does not need to be done every day in order to avoid eating the taste of forbidden leftover meat, because while the vessels are used for repeatedly cooking various types of sacrificial meat, the meat of each and every day becomes a purging agent for the other food, meaning that which is already absorbed in the vessel from the prior day. It's like cooking it the next day pulls it out. Therefore, only after the festival, when the vessel is not being used, must the pot be scoured and rinsed. New topic. The Mishna teaches, and the rabbis say, one may not continue using it in this manner. Rather, one must perform scouring and rinsing before the end of the period during which partaking of a particular food offering, a particular cooked offering is permitted, right? So scouring and rinsing every time within that, day and night that is permitted to eat the meat of a sin offering, for example. So what is the Mishnah saying? Rav Nachman said that Rabbi Bar Avu said one waits for the copper vessel so long as it remains the period of partaking, and then he performs scouring and rinsing on it. From where are these matters derived? Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Abba Yosei Bar Abba, it is written about a copper vessel in which a sin offering was cooked. It shall be scoured and rinsed in water. And it is written in the following verse, every male among the priests may eat it. How so? I.e., what are the verses teaching through this juxtaposition? One waits with it until the end of the period of partaking, and then performs scouring and rinsing on it, right? Which seems to be the majority opinion. Now, the Mishnah teaches scouring. When we say that we're scouring and we're going to perform the Torah, explicit written Torah obligation of scouring and rinsing a pot in which sacrificial meat was cooked. So what exactly are we talking about? So scouring is like the scouring of a cup, and rinsing is like the rinsing of a cup. And scouring and rinsing are both performed with cold water. The sages taught in a baraisa that scouring and rinsing are both performed with cold water. This is the statement of Rebbe. And the rabbis say scouring is performed with hot water and rinsing is performed with cold water. It sounded like both times it was the majority talking, but the first view was what Rebbe said the sages hold, and then the second view is what the rabbis actually hold, which is what we follow. So what is the reasoning of the rabbis? They hold that this law is just as it is with regard to purging the used vessels acquired from Gentiles, from which purging the forbidden absorptions must be performed with hot water. And Rebbe could have said to you, I do not say this statement about purging, which must certainly perform with hot water. Rather, when I say my opinion, it is with regard to the mitzvah of scouring and rinsing, which is performed after purging. And the rabbis could reply, well, if so, that scouring and rinsing are both performed in the same manner, let the verse write the same verb to describe both processes, namely, either it shall be scoured and scoured in water, or it shall be rinsed and rinsed in water. What is meant by the formula, it shall be scoured and rinsed in water? Conclude from the use of two verbs that scouring is performed with hot water and rinsing is performed with cold water. And then Rebbe could answer back, well, if it were written, it shall be scoured and scoured, or it shall be rinsed and rinsed, I would say that the vessel must be scoured 2 times, or that it must be rinsed 2 times. Therefore, it is written, it shall be scoured and rinsed. To tell you that even if both are performed with cold water, there are 2 distinct actions. Scouring is like the scouring of the inside of a cup, and rinsing is like the rinsing of the outside of a cup. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 6. We move on to Mishnah 7. If one cooked in one vessel sacrificial meat and non-sacred meat, or the meat of offerings of the most sacred order and the meat of offerings of lesser sanctity, the status of the food depends upon the taste of the stringent substance. If there is enough of the more sacred meat to impart flavor to the less sacred, or non-sacred meat, then the lenient components of the mixtures must be eaten in accordance with the restrictions of the stringent components therein, insofar as who may partake of them, as well as the time when and the place where they may be eaten. For example, teruma being mixed with non-teruma, but that's not sacrificial offerings, which is what we're talking about here. So, for instance, sin offerings somehow getting mixed with peace offering, right? Sin offerings can only be eaten by priests and for one day and a night. Peace offerings can be eaten by any Jew who is in a state of ritual purity. It can be eaten, sin offerings only in the temple, peace offerings anywhere in Jerusalem, and peace offerings for a day, a night, and the following day. So those are the different elements of the law for sin offerings versus peace offerings. So if it imparts flavor, you have to follow the stringencies of the more stringent one. Apparently, there's going to be an opposite view too. And the copper vessels into which the lenient components were cooked do not require scouring and rinsing, and the lenient components do not disqualify the pieces of meat through contact. Now, with regard to these principles, the lenient components do not assume the status of the stringent components. In the case of a fit wafer that touched an unfit wafer, or a piece of sacrificial meat that touched an unfit piece of sacrificial meat, neither all the wafers nor all the pieces of meat are forbidden. No part is forbidden other than that which is in the place where the item absorbed taste from the unfit wafers or the unfit pieces of meat. That's Mishnah 7. Now the Gemara. According to the Mishnah, if the more sacred meat imparts flavor to the less sacred or non-sacred meat, then the lenient meat is to be treated in the same manner as the more sacred meat. Concurrently, their vessels do not require scouring and rinsing, and the lenient components do not disqualify pieces of meat through contact. So the Gemara says, what is the Mishnah saying? We've said a lot here. What is the Mishnah saying? Is this not inconsistent? The Gemara answers, the Mishnah must be understood otherwise. If there is enough of the more sacred meat to impart flavor to the less sacred or non-sacred meat, then the lenient components of the mixtures must be eaten in accordance with the restrictions of the stringent components. Okay, that makes sense. There's been a mixing, so we're going to apply the greater stringency. Moreover, the copper vessels in which the lenient components were cooked do require scouring and rinsing, and the lenient components do disqualify pieces of meat through contact, right? So it sounds like if you mixed peace offering with sin offering, well, you've disqualified the sin offering meat in terms of it being sin offering meat. The Gemara continues, if the more sacred meat is not sufficient to impart flavor to the less sacred or non-sacred meat, then the lenient components of the mixtures are not eaten in accordance with the restrictions of the stringent components. Moreover, the copper vessels in which the lenient components were cooked do not require scouring and rinsing, and the lenient components do not disqualify pieces of meat through contact. So that sounds like the way we should be understanding it. The Gemara asks, if the offerings of the most sacred order do not impart taste to the offerings of lesser sanctity, granted, the vessels do not require scouring and rinsing commensurate with vessels used to cook offerings of the most sacred order. But isn't it so that the vessels should nevertheless require scouring and rinsing by virtue of having been used for offerings of lesser sanctity? Right? In other words, it's not because they got mixed with offerings of the highest sanctity that they're going to require scouring and rinsing. But haven't we already held that offerings of lesser sanctity do require that their pots be scoured and rinsed? Didn't we already extend that principle? So in their own right, offerings of lesser sanctity are going to trigger scouring and rinsing. Doesn't matter if they were mixed with offerings of greater sanctity. Why would that change the result if already they require scouring and rinsing? Abaye said, what is the meaning of do not require, which the Mishnah states? It means only that the vessels do not require scouring and rinsing, commensurate with vessels used to cook offerings of the most sacred order. But they do require scouring and rinsing as vessels used to cook offerings of lesser sanctity. And Rava said, in accordance with whose opinion is this Mishnah? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, who says, vessels used to cook offerings of lesser sanctity do not require scouring and rinsing at all. But that's a minority opinion. The Gemara analyzes, granted, according to the opinion of Rava, this explanation is consistent with that which the Mishnah teaches. If one cooked in one vessel sacrificial meat and non-sacred meat, or the meat of offerings of the most sacred order, and the meat of offerings of lesser sanctity. The Mishnah provides a second scenario in order to teach that vessels used to cook offerings of lesser sanctity do not require scouring and rinsing, which is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. But according to Abaye, why do I need two cases to teach the single principle that a substance is nullified if its presence is insufficient to impart flavor? And the Gemara answers, even according to Abaye, both cases are necessary in order to teach a law with regard to nullification. As had the Mishnah taught only the case of sacrificial meat and non-sacred meat, I would say that it is non-sacred meat that can nullify sacrificial meat, as sacrificial meat is not its type. But with regard to offerings of the most sacred order and offerings of lesser sanctity, I would say the offerings of lesser sanctity do not nullify those other offerings because they are of the same type. And had the Mishnah taught only the case of offerings of the most sacred order and offerings of lesser sanctity, I would say that it's sacrificial meat that is strong enough to nullify other sacrificial meat. But with regard to non-sacred meat, I would say it is not strong enough to nullify sacrificial meat. You might have thought that. Therefore, it is necessary for the Mishnah to teach both cases. New topic, the Mishnah teaches in the case of a fit wafer that reached an unfit wafer, or a piece of sacrificial meat that touched an unfit piece of sacrificial meat, neither all the wafers nor all the pieces are forbidden. No part is forbidden other than that which is in the place where the item actually absorbed taste from the unfit wafers or the pieces of meat. In relation to this law, the sages taught in a baraisa, with regard to a sin offering, the verse states, whatever shall touch its flesh shall be sacred. One might have thought that this applies to all contact, even if the other piece did not absorb any flavor from the meat of the sin offering. To counter this, the same verse states, with its flesh, which can be translated as in its flesh. And this teaches that this law does not apply unless the other food absorbs something of the sin offering into its meat. Now we're on 97b, and I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. One might have thought that if the sin offering touched part of the piece of something that absorbed flavor from the sin offering, the entire piece should become disqualified. You might have thought that. To counter this, the verse states, whatever shall touch its flesh shall be sacred. To teach that only the section that touches the sin offering is disqualified. How so? What can be done with an item when a section of it is disqualified? If it's meat, one slices off the section of the piece that absorbed the disqualified matter. Additionally, the verse states, whatever shall touch its flesh, but an item is not disqualified if it touches the sin offering's sinews, nor its bones, nor its horns, nor its hooves, which are not its flesh. New topic, the Baraisa continues to interpret the same verse. Whatever shall touch its flesh shall be sacred. Always a good reminder, right? There are different ways for things to become prohibited. Could be prohibited because it's something we're not permitted to eat, like pork, right? That would be prohibited. Low, something that is unfit for Jews to ever eat. But something can also become prohibited because it is set apart to be sacred, most sacred. Only priests can eat it. Therefore, other Jews can't eat it, right? So you can get to a state of prohibition either because something is kind of low and bad, or because it's high and sacred. But either way, it becomes prohibited. And so then we can ask the same kinds of questions. Well, if something prohibited, either because it's always prohibited or because it's prohibited through sanctity, becomes mixed with something that is otherwise permitted, what are we going to do with that mixture? Is the whole mixture prohibited? Can we slice off the part of what was permitted and came into contact with the prohibited and leave the rest that was permitted still permitted? Right? This is what we're asking. Right, so whatsoever shall touch its flesh shall be sacred, and this teaches whatever touches it becomes like it with regard to its status. How so? If the sin offering is disqualified due to any disqualification, then whatever touches it shall become disqualified. And if it is fit, whatever touches it must be eaten in accordance with the stringent regulations that apply to the sin offering. Therefore, a piece of meat that touches the meat of a sin offering may be eaten only in accordance with the terms of the consumption of a sin offering. For example, it may be eaten only by male priests and only for one day and a night. The Gemara asks, if sacrificial meat touched the meat of a disqualified sin offering, why should the sacrificial meat become forbidden? Should not the positive mitzvah of eating the sacrificial meat come and override the prohibition against eating the disqualified substance that was absorbed in it? And Rabbis said a positive mitzvah does not override a prohibition that relates to the temple, whereas sometimes positive mitzvahs do override prohibitions. Not in the temple, right? So Rav's opinion relates to that which is taught in the Baraisa, as it is stated in a verse concerning the Pesach, nor shall you break a bone of it. Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh says both a bone that contains marrow and a bone that does not contain marrow are included in this prohibition. And this statement is analyzed. If one means to break a bone in order to eat its marrow, why would that be prohibited? Should not the positive mitzvah of eating the edible parts of the offering, including the marrow, come and override the prohibition of not breaking the bone of the Pesach? Rather, it must be that a positive mitzvah does not override a prohibition when it relates to the Holy Temple. Rav Ashi said, if sacrificial meat touches a disqualified sin offering, this is not simply a case of a positive mitzvah in conflict with a prohibition, because the verse states, whatever shall touch its flesh shall be sacred. Treating the item as consecrated is itself a positive mitzvah. Consequently, both a positive mitzvah and a prohibition stand in opposition to eating that sacrificial meat, and a positive mitzvah does not override both a prohibition and a positive mitzvah. A little bit technical, a little bit challenging today, but basic principles, right, of when are we going to apply the stringencies of the most sacred to something that came into contact with it, and when do we not do that? Okay, I'm seeing no questions or comments, so that's what I've got for us tonight. And with God's help, see you tomorrow, Thursday, regular Thursday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a good night.